We've got 62 people joining us on the line. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us, and we trust that you're going to enjoy the next 35 to 40 minutes as we go through this webinar with Janusz. Just to introduce Janusz, he's from Hahn & Hahn. And we've been doing a series of webinars with Janusz where he's been sharing his legal expertise with us. And today the topic of discussion is Regulation 638. The regulation was promulgated recently, has some significant changes that we all need to be aware of, and so we're going to ask Janusz to take us through that today. Hopefully you've all seen the housekeeping rules or requirements for today's webinar. In terms of the audio, please make sure that you've obviously got your volume up so that you can hear. You won't be able to use your telephone for connection for this webinar. If you'd like to maximize, the upper right corner of the slide window is going to be the best one for viewing the material, and at the end you just click on restore for the normal view. If for any reason you lose us during the course of the presentation, please don't stress. The presentation is being recorded. It will be edited and it will be going live onto Food Focus website, as well as onto our YouTube channel, as well as onto Janusz's YouTube channel. We've got an opportunity for you to ask questions. So please, if you'd like to make sort of contact with us, please use the chat button, not the question button. You can see it on the right-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to jot down your message there, and we'll try as far as possible to answer as many questions as we can. If for any reason we don't manage to get to your question, don't stress. We will be doing a follow-up article and we'll write a response to all the questions that you might have. So please, just bear that in mind. From our perspective, please make a note so that we can chat about them at the end. There'll also be a survey at the end of the webinar. Won't you please take a minute just to record it, to complete it, so that we can get some feedback and we can make sure that we've got, we're kind of keeping you up to date and we're giving you as the most effective options as far as webinars are concerned. Enough from me. Over to our legal eagle, our favorite lawyer who knows everything there is to know about the food industry, Janusz. It's all in your court. We all know Janusz as being a partner at Hahn & Hahn. He's a custodian member of SAFOST and he sits on the Food Law Advisory Group. So Janusz, thank you so much for helping us to understand the new hygiene regulations for 2018. It's over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, it's a big topic to speak about, seeing that it's a brand new regulation, or pieces of it are brand new anyway. And sometimes it's like wine, with time it gets better, so to speak. As you read the regulation over and over, you start to realize, oh, there's a little bit here and there's a little bit there, and there's some hidden meaning or something that they intended to be implemented, which you didn't pick up on a first, second, or third read. So I really hope that I do bring the most important highlights to you. But it's certainly not a review of the regulation from page 1 to the end. It's really a highlight, and we're going to look at specific issues that you think are important. We presume in bringing this seminar that you already know R962. But in a way, this is comparative. This talk is about how is it different? What more do you have to do? If you've never worked with hygiene regulations, we may have to give you further information later. Okay.
Sure. No problem. Okay, so now I'm just trying to get the slide to move on. Give me a second. For some reason, the presentation is stuck. Let's try this again. Okay.
There we go. So I think it's good to understand the why we are where we are and where we've come from. So R638 of 22 June 2018, which is less than a month ago, has the history which flows from R962 of 23 November 2012, which of course many of you will know actually follows from the earlier regulation which used to fall under the Health Act. Now, the Department of Health realized R962 was not fit for its purposes of food safety assurance and needed serious revision, probably in the light of the big listeria outbreak and what has happened recently. But prior to the listeria outbreak, they'd already started revising R962, and R364 was published for comment, and many comments were obviously received. We can see
that was about 20. No, sorry, Janusz, that was about 2014. Am I correct?
It's so long ago, I actually can't remember. It might have been 20. Yeah. Certainly, it was several years ago. Let me say this.
Yes.
Definitely. It was before this entire listeria saga we're going through now.
Yes.
They definitely considered the comments because R638 has some significant differences from R364, but in other respects follows R364 quite closely, and we'll be getting to those in the following slides. Now, obviously, the listeriosis outbreak brought the inadequacies of R962 into sharp focus, and it brought to the attention of the minister that urgent action was required to revise these regulations. And quite frankly, the minister even mentioned it on television when he was announcing the listeria outbreak, that these regulations were not fit for purpose. So R638 suddenly popped out of the system on 22 June 2018, and there were major changes coming to effect which were intended to ensure food safety, and also clearly included transport vehicles, including third-party vehicles. Now, for some businesses, this is a really, really big change and will require a whole management change of how one manages the hygiene and food safety in vehicles.
So we still have a certificate of acceptability. That hasn't disappeared.
Sure. No, that I think always has to be there. Otherwise, first of all, how would you certify a premises? But secondly, I suppose the public also needs to know that the premises that they are at are in fact up to scratch. So very importantly, when they start speaking about the certificate of acceptability now, they are speaking about that you're not allowed to handle food or permit food to be handled unless you have this valid certificate of acceptability. But suddenly they also say, and this also applies to an outsourced vehicle used for the transport of perishable food on behalf of a person in charge of food premises. So you're a company, you've got food premises for which you have a certificate of acceptability. Even if you are using third-party logistics, that third-party logistics also has to fall under your certificate of acceptability. So it brings an additional management burden onto you, and it's not something you can simply say, well, it's not me, it's someone else. I suppose in an extreme case, we can talk about delivery of restaurant food, for example, where in the past, they simply got a chap with a motorcycle and he would deliver food. Now you have to ensure that his motorcycle and the box on the back of the motorcycle will be compliant with your certificate of acceptability if you're a restaurant.
So, Janusz, if we can just stop there for a moment, how would a company practically manage this? I mean, I could be using any of the large third-party distribution companies, and I'm not even sure which vehicle is going to be coming to transport my product. They may have a whole fleet, and they're not necessarily dedicated vehicles. If I work with dedicated vehicles, that one makes practical sense to me, but what if it's a non-dedicated vehicle? How would I comply with this requirement?
So I think there are two ways to read this. The one way to read this is that if it's a third-party vehicle dedicated to you, it will fall under your COA.
Yes.
If it's a third-party vehicle run by someone else, as you now are talking about, then they would have to have a COA, which obviously you would have to have sight of, and to ensure that their vehicles are at all times compliant with that COA. Because it speaks of a valid certificate of acceptability. It doesn't necessarily say that it's got to be your certificate of acceptability if it's a third-party vehicle.
Okay, all right. Okay, so in terms of our normal processes for, supplier quality assurance, when we engage with a third party, I think most companies will already have as a requirement that they've, any vehicle should have a valid certificate of acceptability. But I think the way that it is now worded in the regulation, it is much clearer. It's always been a bit of a contentious issue around vehicles. Now I think it's very clear that, there should be a certificate for vehicles if those vehicles are not, that don't form part of your premises. Now,
sure. But I think but Linda, I think where the big difference comes in is when you start speaking about smaller businesses.
Oh yeah, no, I understand. No, I understand. It all of a sudden brings into, into question again, who should be delivering my food? Should a local taxi company be delivering our food, or is that not hygienic? I know we've had discussions before about, Uber delivering fast food, and how will this requirement address that kind of practice? Obviously we appreciate the fact that we're trying to build the economy, but there are hygiene requirements that still need to be in place. Now, in terms of the certificate of acceptability, do I need to reapply because of this new regulation?
No. So the way I read this is, unless you make a substantial change to your premises or your process that you're using on your premises, or in addition, if the person in charge of the premises changes. So then you would need to reapply. But in the event that you already have a certificate and everything stays the same, you continue doing what you were doing when the certificate was issued, and the same person is still in charge of the premises, you wouldn't need to do anything at this stage. You would simply continue until some event that triggers the requirement to have a reinspection occurs. So 3.6 talks about the fact that if you make any changes in respect of the food premises for which a certificate of acceptability has been issued, relating to the provisions of regulation 5 and 6, while 5 and 6 relate to upgrades, modification, etc., you need to notify your local authority. It doesn't necessarily say that they have to reinspect you, but presumably they would then reinspect you, and you would then get a new COA. For that matter of fact, you may get a rejection. They might say, well, no, what you're doing now is in fact not acceptable. But certainly that would trigger the likelihood of a reinspection, at which point you get a new COA.
Yeah, and I think this is quite important because, when I read this part of the regulation is I need to inform the local authority in advance. So before we actually make any changes to the kind of processes or the facility, we would actually need to engage with the municipality.
Absolutely. So you would get pre-approval from them to do what you intend to do, which would in any case be a wise thing, because imagine you've now gone through your upgrade and then you are told, but we're not going to issue a COA because we have the following reservations.
I think, as part of the sort of town planning process, any, changes to buildings and what have you would need to fall under that process anyway. So hopefully there would be a catch net, but yeah, to me, this one has been worded so much more clearly now that I think it's something that we should definitely take note of. We still need to display the certificate of acceptability, and the person in charge, no changes with regards to that, but I know you have some very specific advice as to who this person should actually be.
Okay, so one very interesting revision to the regulations under R638, you'll see on the slide the capital letter word must. So in the previous version, in R962, the word shall was used throughout. Shall has been replaced by must to make it absolutely clear that this is not an optional thing. It is prescribed. You can do nothing else except this to be compliant. It's not a suggestion, in other words. Okay. So that is the first major amendment, I think, throughout the whole Act, throughout the whole regulation, is that they've replaced everywhere shall with must to make it peremptory. Okay, but I think what's really important to understand is that the person in charge who must be named is the person that's actually in charge of the premises. And this will become very important when we go further and we see what are the duties of the person in charge and the liabilities of the person in charge. because the person in charge is in fact the one who will carry the can when things go wrong. It's not going to be somebody in head office who instructed that person to do something, although they could be liable together. But certainly the person in charge will be frontline when the problem starts. But very importantly also, there's now a specific, clearly stated requirement that the certificate of acceptability will expire permanently if you do not update the certificate of acceptability with the new name of the person in charge within 30 days of the new person taking over. So there's a very strong obligation here. When the person in charge moves on and someone else takes over, you best notify the municipality, get a new COA issued, otherwise the one you currently have will expire permanently. It's not suspended, it's gone. You've got to start again.
The whole process all over again, with the costs and the complications that may come with that. And I know it can be quite trying to actually get the certificate of acceptability, but at the end of the day, I think you would at least need to demonstrate you've done everything you can in order to make the change within that 30-day period.
Yeah, look, I think what the regulation requires, it says such person shall inform the local authority in writing. So you need to do that. You need to have proof that you informed them in writing. I think once you've done that, the ball is in their court. Your certificate would not expire through inaction of the local authority, but certainly it will expire through your inaction. And it's definitely not an excuse. I must mention this. There was very recently a case in the Constitutional Court relating to gun licenses. And the Constitutional Court was very clear. It's not an excuse to say, but they will do nothing, therefore I'm not going to submit it. If you didn't do what you had to do, you're out.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, we can't make any changes to the certificate because then that would be considered fraudulent.
No, of course. I mean, for goodness sake, don't just go and change the name on the certificate. Even if you have in fact notified the municipality, just keep a copy of the letter with proof it was sent and wait.
Yes. So now let's talk a little bit about this person in charge, because it's this person has taken on, I think, a whole new set of responsibilities in terms of this hygiene regulation. And I'm definitely in favor of these changes, because I think research shows that having this person in charge taking on these additional responsibilities can have a significant impact on the food safety management system in an establishment. So what is this new person in charge, or what are the new requirements for the person in charge?
So the person in charge is Regulation 10 under R638, and I'm just holding the actual regulation in my hand now. It's got 18 subsections or sub-regulations. And they vary widely across the whole scope of food safety and food hygiene. But I think probably some of the most important ones are the ones we're going to discuss now. And the first one is that that person in charge must himself or herself ensure that they are suitably qualified. Now, this is quite interesting. It's not saying the employer must make sure that the person in charge is suitably qualified. What it's saying is that if you are the person in charge, you yourself must ensure that you are suitably qualified or otherwise adequately trained in the principles and practices of food safety and hygiene. You'll immediately note the words food safety now start appearing in R638.
Yeah, new definition.
And that you need to have training through an accredited, or so you need training. I just want to get the exact wording. So as appropriate, and that the training is accredited or conducted by an inspector where applicable. Now, I've been discussing this with my colleagues. You know, what does this actually mean? Training is accredited or conducted by an inspector. Considering the number of food premises we have in South Africa and the very small number of inspectors we have, and to some extent, in many cases, the inadequate skill level of some of these inspectors, it would be, I don't think as a person in charge, you could say that you are suitably qualified or otherwise adequately trained if you had been trained by an inspector who in fact has no experience and minimal training themselves.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be enough just to say, oh, but I was trained by an inspector. The obligation is on you to make sure you are adequately trained. So that's the first thing. The second one is training is accredited. Now, accredited by whom comes the question. Now, the way that bit is written there is rather odd. I think the grammar is wrong. It talks about training is accredited or conducted by an inspector. I'm pretty certain that it was never the intention that the inspector would be accrediting training institutions. The accredited must mean accredited by someone else.
Yes.
But accredited by whom is the question. So in South Africa, there are not a lot of accreditation bodies. SANAS is one. I had a look at CETA. I don't think CETA can accredit a training institution, although CETA themselves are an accredited body.
Yes. Yes.
And I think from a safety perspective, if you want to be safe that you are meeting these requirements, you'd need to be trained and suitably qualified through an accredited institution, which has been accredited by SANAS, or someone that has been accredited by someone that has been accredited by SANAS, or go for some sort of CETA arranged training in as far as it exists. The training by an inspector is possible, but you would need to make sure that that inspector himself has enough skill and information and knowledge. The next,
I think, sorry, Janusz, the previous version, Regulation 364, was quite explicit in terms of what accredited meant, and did in fact refer to CETA accreditation. I was interested to see that specific wording was omitted from this version of the regulation, and it would be interesting to understand why that is the case, because it was actually clearer in the draft. Obviously, conducted by an inspector, that was always part of the regulation. It's, as I understand it, it's always been a function of the municipalities. But as you say, the problem has just been the capability as well as the capacity to be able to do that.
But the way this regulation is written, it's moved the responsibility onto the person in charge to ensure that they are adequately trained.
Yes.
It's not enough anymore to say, oh, but the municipality didn't train me. Or I don't have enough inspectors, therefore I don't have training. They've created the alternative of going through an accredited training body. And I think that's going to become very important. I suspect that there will be a whole number of private organizations coming around who are going to become accredited and are going to be offering this training.
Yes, and I think if you look at other parts of the world, you have a very similar structure in both the UK and the USA. There are a number of accreditation bodies that specifically do this kind of work and offer this kind of accreditation. They look at, there's a defined syllabus, there's a defined length of training in order to ensure that the training that's presented for the person in charge is in fact suitable, that it's actually going to qualify them in the practices of food safety and hygiene. Because there are plenty of training courses out there, but I think the point here is, are we comparing apples with apples? Is a half-day course going to suitably qualify you for this role, or are you looking at a 3 to 5 day training course, which is currently what the requirement at this level is in the UK? It's a 3 to 5 day training course because the person in charge, it must understand the implications. We can't have the blind leading the blind. So yes, I think there's going to be some interesting time ahead in terms of how this one actually unfolds, and maybe even some further guidance will be needed from the department, in this regard. Now, it's also still a requirement that everyone else should be trained, but again, there's some changes.
That is, in fact, I think the far bigger issue, because persons in charge, there are one per premises, whereas the number of food handlers could be many, and they're constantly coming and going, unlike the persons in charge. So if you look at the QSR business, in every fast food, there are a number of people working there. And I promise you, if you have to go back every week, you're going to find there's probably at least one new person, and one person has left every week.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's probably the same in a food production facility, a bakery, or a ready processed foods or whatever. So this again puts an obligation on the person in charge that any other person working on the food premises must also be suitably qualified or adequately trained in the principles and practices of safety and hygiene. But here the wording is different, because that training must be by an inspector or by any other suitable person.
Yes.
Now, I suppose there can be quite a lot of debate about who is a suitable person. Is a suitable person simply another guy standing next to you at the counter chopping the whatever they're serving? Or would a suitable person be someone that has, in fact, got the adequate training and principles and practice of food safety at some sort of tertiary level? And I suspect there will be debate around that. When is somebody suitably trained? I think where all of this will come to the front and center is when you have another Listeria type outbreak, and it turns out that the problem arose due to poor food handling, and then the company will have to explain how did they comply with this section and how did they train the food handlers. And if it turns out that they didn't actually formally train the food handlers, but sort of expected them just to learn from the person to the left and the right of them, they may face the wrath of the courts over that, because they'll be probably found to be non-compliant.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But it's not just training. I see now the regulation also requires an assessment.
Absolutely. So, and again, part of the problem that came in is that you train somebody once and you presume they're now trained. You know, people go away on long leave, they come back and they've forgotten what they knew, etc. So what you have now is you're going to need routine assessments. I don't say how frequently, but routine can't be once every 5 or every 10 years.
No.
You know, it's got to be more frequent, and one can debate how frequent that is. It's probably quarterly or 6 monthly, somewhere around there, I would think would probably be considered routine, or considered to determine the impact of the training. So you need to then know what has the person learned, and you need to arrange follow-up training as applicable. So if you find that this food handler now, he's forgotten some of the stuff he's been taught. You know, they weren't washing their hands properly or whatever the case was. Well, then you've got to retrain in accordance with paragraph B again. So this is creating quite a burden of training, but I think very important.
No, absolutely. And I think for those of us that have been, you know, involved with supplying the retailers, you know, this requirement has been in part of the auditing protocol for a while. I think many companies are used to conducting refresher training, but I think the assessment aspect, you know, that's going to pose a few challenges. But the last paragraph to me is probably the most interesting, because it pretty much boils down to, if you haven't written it down, you haven't done it.
Sure, but I think what's important is the words training programs, which means it's got to be formalized training. It can't be training through osmosis. There has to be, let's call it classroom type training. There's got to be taking people aside, taking them away from the workplace, say, we're now going to be training. This is the program we're going to follow. Program doesn't mean a sort of, hey, you wash your hands. That's not a program. I think program implies something structured.
Yes.
So so I think that this whole clause 10.1 is introducing a whole lot of training requirements, but importantly, it's putting that obligation on the person in charge of the food premises. So if you are that person in charge, you are going to have to fight head office, so to speak, to ensure that you get the resources. Otherwise, you don't want to be the person in charge of the food premises, because there's criminal liability for non-compliance.
Absolutely.
It's not simply just a job anymore where you say, oh, well, head office HR didn't do it or whatever. So I think that is really, really important to follow. If you don't do that, there will be serious consequences for you.
And I think there's one of the other paragraphs that's not specifically mentioned on your slide, but in addition to providing the training, the person in charge is responsible for ensuring that the correct behavior is applied. So in other words, food handlers and the correct practices have to be in place. It's not good enough just to have trained people. You also then have to ensure that they are complying with the legal requirements. It's the enforcement, daily enforcement of the requirements that is also that person's responsibility.
So regulation 10.2 clearly states that it's in fact the obligation and the duty of the person in charge of the premises to ensure that the regulations are fully complied with, which includes the food handlers, includes everything about the premises. It includes the design of the premises.
Yes.
It's really quite an onerous position. You know, it's like the captain of a ship or a pilot of a Boeing 747. You may have head office who have business plans and all of that, but when you're sitting in the pilot seat of a 747, you're in charge and you make the decisions. Head office can't tell you to take a shortcut because there's a requirement and it's got to be complied with. And if it's not, you will pay the penalty.
Now we see the word food safety come into the regulation for the first time. I think it's always been implied, but now we see there's formally a definition for for food safety, and a number of the regulations now you can see are there to specifically address food safety aspects. Won't you take us through those?
Sure. Look, I've just highlighted a few of them. Because, as you say, in the past, these regulations were really hygiene regulations. One would presume hygiene implies food safety, but it doesn't always. And there are aspects of food safety that have nothing to do with hygiene. So these regulations have gone further. I just want to quickly see where I've got if there was a definition I wanted to refer to here. So food safety under these regulations means the assurance that food will not cause harm to the consumer when it is prepared or eaten according to the intended use. So as a person in charge of the premises, you need to ensure that that is complied with. You can't cause harm to the consumer when it's prepared or eaten according to its intended use. And the various food safety aspects that you can immediately pick up on is, the first one is that's just the use of the word must there. I think the 100 viable microorganisms was always there. The 8.3 talks about that non-prepacked, ready-to-consume foods, including food served as meals and displayed in an open container. We all know about droplets, etc. But now suddenly there's a prohibition on the use of bare hands, as I read it, unless there's really no other way to do it. So bare hands can't be the first option. Bare hands must be the exception.
And I think we've seen, you've almost seen a change in this if you look at the retail outlets. It's not possible, I think, in most retail outlets now to actually help yourself to bread rolls. You have to actually be helped. They've kind of been moved so that somebody has to assist you. I think, if someone doesn't assist you, there's normally tongs now, which are also available to even prevent the consumer's bare hands from touching food, that's being displayed in open containers.
No, sure. So, but that is a big one that's been brought in because, I mean, in the past, I've had numerous consultations with clients who wanted to know, can they continue to have bare hands or must the staff wear gloves? And of course, we all know that the arguments pro and con for using gloves, against using gloves, but it's now in the regulation.
So we're going to start using a lot more gloves.
Sure, I think so. I think if you're in the glove business, you're going to, you're on a good wicket. I think so.
Good time to start a glove business. Okay, then temperature. There's some changes in terms of temperatures.
Yes. So what's happened now is they've also gone and changed the temperatures to be more specific in relation to food safety. I suppose they've looked internationally what's going on. And on the basis of that, they've then decided on specific temperatures, and these are now different from R962. If you have a look at, I don't know if it's on the next slide. There we go. Perishable food that will be sold directly to a consumer within 4 hours of being processed or prepared, as opposed to in the past it was 1 hour. Or that will be consumed on the food premises within 4 hours of being processed or prepared. So the temperature limitations have now been extended for a longer period. Now, that's almost counterintuitive because if these regulations are intended to increase food safety, why has this time period been increased? Unless, of course, such a longer time period doesn't impact on food safety, but will in fact reduce food waste, which is another very important topic that everybody has to be very aware of. It also now talks about whole, freshly caught or harvested raw fish as opposed to simply unprocessed raw fish. So they are being far more specific. We're talking about freshly caught fish, which are now being referred to as opposed to unprocessed fish. The regulations now, for example, include an exclusion for frozen fish and seafood, but having said that, the surface temperature of which has not exceeded 5 degrees Celsius, what we're talking about here is foodstuff that have been thawed.
Yes,
so in the past, if they were thawed, they could have gone up to 7 degrees.
Yes, yeah.
This has now been reduced to 5 degrees Celsius.
5 degrees,
again, probably because of the type of contamination one can get at 7 degrees as opposed to at 5 degrees.
There we go. We now know that Listeria grows quite well at 7 degrees.
Sure. But there's also obviously other bacteria which can become a problem at around 7.
Of course.
Less likely at 5.
Okay.
They've also introduced the fact that fish have to be now handled in accordance with the NRCS compulsory specification. And then they brought in this provision that says frozen food thawed for further processing may be refrozen, provided that the thawing process is as short as possible and does not exceed 10 hours as the case may be. And I think this is because of various practices in industry of thawing frozen products, processing them, repackaging them, refreezing them. So they wanted better control over that. However, they've obviously not banned it. It's still permitted. It's now just regulated.
Regulated, yeah, and now the regulation is definitely tighter, tighter than what it was previously.
So the food temperatures in Annexure E that you saw in the previous slide.
Yes.
For frozen products such as sorbet, ice cream, excluding soft serve, as well as excluding frozen fish and fishery products, below 18 degrees Celsius. Any other marketed frozen food products will be below -12 degrees Celsius. Chilled products, raw unpreserved fish, mollusks, crustaceans, edible offal, poultry meat and milk, below 4 degrees Celsius. And any other perishable food that must be kept chilled or to prevent spoilage, below 5 degrees Celsius. So you can see that. Sorry?
Definitely some changes. They've lowered some of the temperatures.
And then for heated products, in other words, typically your dairy products, your QSR type products where you're getting a chicken or something like that, no longer has to be over 65, now only over 60 degrees. So they have lowered that temperature, but I think that is in line with what is happening in other parts of the world. 65 is probably safer, but 60 is obviously, again, extends the shelf life, which means there's less wastage.
Of course. There's a lot with regards to butcheries. I mean, obviously the regulation has previously addressed meat products, but now we see a specific focus on butchery equipment, even butchery cleaning methods.
Yes, I think it's very extensive, and I think if you're in that business, you really need to read these regulations very carefully, as well as the annexures, because they are in fact very detailed. And short of making this whole presentation a butchery hygiene presentation, what I'm doing instead is I'm just going to highlight 1 or 2 things on the meat products. But if you are in that business, you better look at this really carefully. I'm looking more at the transport of these products, because I think there are issues related to transport which are quite common in industry, multi-purpose trucks, etc. So the one thing in the regulations that strikes you is that it now says that a person may only transport meat and meat products in a suitable vehicle, which is provided for the exclusive use of the transportation and delivery of meat and meat products. Now, meat products, of course, has its own definition, and one presumes that the way it's written, I read it several times, and it's effectively not identifiable cuts. It's processed meat. It's I suppose and I suppose sausages. Things like that. So that in itself may cause a problem, because if you need a dedicated truck for transporting, say, sausages and mince and so on, in the retail trade, this may in fact end up causing some sort of additional burden in logistics. And then it says that the compartment of a vehicle used for the transportation of meat and meat products from an abattoir to food premises or place where the meat will be processed further or be sold to the public must be lined with a suitable impervious jointless materials that be capable of being cleaned and when necessary disinfected easily, and that the best available method must apply when a single-use vehicle is not available or it is impracticable to use a single-use vehicle to transport small quantities of meat and meat products. Now, that last clause mustn't be seen that a big supermarket chain can simply decide, well, they just won't buy any of these vehicles and then they won't have them and therefore they can use this as a get-out-of-jail-free card. This is rather for exceptional circumstances.
Yes.
And if the exceptional circumstances don't apply, you must comply with the requirement of the regulation fully.
Absolutely, yeah. And in terms of the compartments, the separation and what have you, it goes more than just meat.
Sure.
In terms of transportation.
Yeah. So there's a section on standards and requirements for transport of food. And again, the words must and may not have now been used throughout this regulation to make it clear that this is prescribed and not merely a suggestion, as I've seen some people consider it. So one of the important issues is that you need to clean and separate compartments to avoid contamination or separate vehicles. And you cannot transport food together with contaminated food or waste food. Now, one needs to read that rather carefully because contaminated food or waste food, what does it mean when you have returns, product returns? How do you transport product returns on the same truck as you are delivering? Can you, at the same time that you drop off new supplies, pick up old ones? Where does it fall under this? Or do you have to have a completely separate compartment isolated from the rest of the product? You obviously cannot transport poison or any harmful substance. So if you are delivering to a smallish, say, retailer, you cannot go with one truck and in that truck you will have pool chemicals, cleaning materials and foodstuffs all together. You will have to separate them.
Yeah.
I don't know how this will have, sorry?
So mixed loads can then therefore be a problem.
If you don't have separate compartments, but I'm thinking immediately of those like forecourt delivery vehicles that deliver to the small forecourt shops. A smallish truck arrives and a lot of things get offloaded. Now, I don't know if they have or don't have separate compartments. I don't recall seeing one of the separate compartment. Doesn't mean that somehow internally they don't have separate compartments. Clearly, no live animals, so leave your pets at home. And then you obviously can't transport any object that may contaminate or spoil the food.
Okay. Right, then there's some specific exemptions. So who does have a get out of jail card?
Yeah, look, these are obviously, again, exceptional circumstances. So, you know, we're talking here about handling or processing of I say hunted meat, but you know what I mean. It's game, effectively, fish that has been caught, packing, storage, display, sale or transport of unprocessed agricultural crops. These are now dealt with quite differently from how they were dealt with in R962. In a way, I think they see these as being much less of a risk than other types of foodstuffs.
Yes.
But still, you need to, the principles of best available method and good agricultural and manufacturing practice must apply. The provisions of other applicable legislation where relevant shall still apply. Unprocessed agricultural crops cannot be offered to sale at a local authority market. So it's quite interesting. Although you can, products which would be exempt from R638 cannot then be sold at a market.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's a loophole. It's always been a grey area. You know, does it belong to the Department of Agriculture? Does it belong to the Department of Health? I think now they've closed that loophole. If it's unprocessed and it's going to be sold at a market, it still falls within the scope of the regulation. So
presumably what this is for is to unprocessed agricultural crops that are being transported for further processing. Because I can't see what else you would do with them.
What else you would do with it? Yeah, what else you would do with it? Right. So, what's it going to cost us? What are the implications in terms of not complying with the new regulation?
Sure. So, and again, I've got to say that the person who's in charge of the premises, who allows the regulations not to be complied with, or alternatively is instrumental in not allowing them to be complied with, will be guilty of a criminal offence and is on conviction liable to a penalty provided in section 18(1) of the Act. Now, this is very interesting because the R962, although it said it was illegal, it was a contravention of the law, never stated what the penalty was. And there's a very peculiar provision in law that a law cannot simply prohibit something without saying what happens if you then fall foul of it. So they've now fixed that. In other words, it's now very clear. The person in charge contravenes, will be liable to conviction, will be prosecuted, and can then be given one of these fines or even imprisonment. Fine or imprisonment of 6 months for first conviction, second conviction, you see the third conviction. And then, of course, don't forget it's a regulation under the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act, and all other acts and regulations also apply. So this doesn't in some way supersede anything else. R638 is a little window under the FCD Act. There are many other regulations under the FCD Act, and of course there's many regulations under other acts that still have to be complied with. For example, the Meat Safety Act.
Yes, yes. I think, Janusz, there's probably a couple of other things that people will want us to chat about, and maybe we need to look at it in terms of a follow-up, because there's now some specific information required for processing records. You specifically will need to have a recall procedure in place. You will also need to formally notify the Department of Health if you have to activate a recall. So I think there's a whole nother webinar waiting for us just in terms of the additional documentation, which is now required by the new regulation. So I'm just going to.
Linda, can I mention something about recall? Because in the light of the recent listeria outbreak, the frozen vegetables recently, and so on, so the provisions of this of R638, if one looks at the sub-regulation 1018, is quite interesting, because what it says that the person in charge of the premises must make sure that there's a traceability system is maintained according to the best available method, and that a recall procedure is in place, and that any incident requiring recall activation is reported to the local inspector, etc., etc. What it doesn't do, and still doesn't do, the Department of Health cannot order a recall.
Yes, no, I see that.
What it's saying is that you trigger a recall, then you notify the department.
Yes,
not the other way around.
Yeah, the onus is on you. No, I see that. Okay, so in terms of some questions, I see there's one question in relation to the IMT inspections that are currently taking place. Karen, thank you very much for your question. We have this current, I suppose, dispensation or intervention as a result of the listeriosis outbreak, where the incident management team have prepared checklists, they've prepared an SOP, it's available on the NICD website. Is it going to be in addition to the requirements of 638, given the current situation with the listeriosis outbreak? Do you see any contradiction? Do you see any potential problems coming with regards to the new requirements and these inspections that are already taking place?
Okay, look, I'll be honest, I don't know what's in the incident management team's checklist. I'm not an inspector, I don't know. But it's not the law. Anybody can draft a checklist. This is the law. This is the regulation. This is enforceable. The other thing is trying to help industry, I suppose. It's not. There can be, if you fail the other inspection, they can't then implement anything because it's not a regulation.
Yes. Yeah.
They can't say, oh, point 10, point 5, point 2, you didn't get a tick. Okay, so you didn't get a tick. So what?
Yes, no. I think there's a purpose for the IMT. I think that the process that they followed has been specific to upskilling and capacitating the inspectors that are involved with inspections at processed meat facilities as a result of the listeriosis outbreak. Yes. I don't think there's anything that's really controversial in those checklists. I think it's all sound food safety requirements. I think we all know that the law in some cases is silent on specifics. So, it uses words like suitable and adequate. And I think, the IMT checklists have really just tried to qualify some of those words in the context of meat processing and what would be considered good practice in terms of meat processing. Another question coming from Arthur, and I think this is, something that you alluded to yourself in terms of this high staff turnover. And having the person in charge as the manager. So what Arthur's saying is using the general manager for the division no longer applicable? Can that person no longer be the person in charge? How would you, as opposed to having the restaurant manager as the person in charge?
Okay, so my view, it has never been acceptable to have a general manager sitting at a remote location to be the person in charge, because they're not in charge. They have no idea what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and it's only when there's a problem that they suddenly become aware, although they may have a program where they occasionally visit the various stores or restaurants. The intention of the law has always been that there is a person in charge of the premises. I think it's difficult to argue what that means other than it must be someone actually at the premises. It's like saying you have a Boeing 747, but the captain's sitting in Johannesburg.
Yes.
It can't be. It can't be. No. So I think it's just much clearer now, because there are specific obligations on that person. But I don't think, in my view, anything has actually changed as regarding who that person in charge should be in an organizational structure.
Yes, no, I agree. I think there are some practicalities, but I think it also, if I was the general manager and I am now the person in charge, the risk is, how do I carry out my legal responsibilities given the fact that I'm not able to, supervise the activities of the food handlers? I land up in jail for something that I simply am not aware of because I'm not on site. I must be honest, I wouldn't be comfortable putting my name on that certificate or being given that responsibility without being in a position to actually exercise, the required supervision. Rajan's got a good question. Rajan, I think this, this is something that we would all like to understand, is if we've got a qualified food technologist or a food scientist, would that person be considered suitably trained in food safety and hygiene? I think there's probably two parts to the question. The one being, if this is the person in charge, would that formal qualification count as sufficiently qualified? But then secondly, could this person then be the person that trains the food handlers on site? Would they be suitably qualified to train other people?
Okay, so I presume there are different syllabi at different tertiary training institutions. So to the extent that your food science or food technology degree adequately covers food safety, because I can't presume they all do, but if it does, then you would be suitably qualified or otherwise adequately trained. In fact, you would be simply suitably qualified. I mean, you'd have a certificate on the wall that says you're suitably qualified. And I actually think that you could, in fact, be the suitable person. I don't think that you would need to get somebody external if you had someone like that. And in fact, I think it brings me to an important point, is that the training of the food handlers can, in fact, be a training officer in a company. It doesn't necessarily have to be an external person. They must just be suitably trained themselves and be able to train.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we find that in many companies where you would have a qualified food technologist, and that person does the training for other personnel. I think it's all going to be about making sure that that training is in fact adequate. Hanita wants to know about the street vendors. And I mean, at the end of the day, we know that this piece of legislation impacts on all businesses that handle foods. The only exception would be if food is not actually being sold, if food's being manufactured but it's not actually being sold in a private home. So yeah, these new requirements are going to impact on street vendors too.
So sure, strictly speaking, the municipality's inspectorate can go to a part of town with a lot of street vendors and go through there and say, where's your certificate of acceptability? What food safety training have you had? Yes. But we all know that these things rarely happen for various reasons. I think it would be very wise of a municipality to offer some sort of free training to all the people that are selling food informally in food safety.
Yes.
Just a brief, some sort of introduction, so they at least have an idea.
Yes, yeah, and I think, you know, if the department were clever, you know, they would use those resources in areas where there's nobody else involved, and then, you know, allow formal training providers to continue in areas where that would be the best available method. You know, for street vendors who can't or may not be able to access any other forms of training, why not ensure that the inspectors are actually performing this task. All right. So if you Rajan's question was.
Sorry, Linda, I just want to comment on something. It's possible that the extension of the time to 4 hours from the cooking to when it's sold and not having to comply with the temperature requirements in those 4 hours may in fact be in order to largely exclude informal food vendors.
Yes.
Because typically the food they make gets sold within that sort of 4-hour window.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely, and I mean, I think from that perspective, we know that there are things that or research has shown that those are that's safe. Okay, an interesting one here. Is this applicable to pet food manufacturing?
Well, no, pet food doesn't fall under the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act at all.
Yes.
So it's a different law, different ministry, different everything. So
it would all be in relation to farm feeds and
Fertilizers Act under the Department of Agriculture.
Okay. There we go. Okay, so with regards to regulation, Mornay wants to know, despite sub-regulation 11A, do people have to reapply within a year of this regulation for a new COA? That's not how I understood it. I think it's only, if, as you said initially, if there have been substantial changes. Otherwise, your existing certificate of acceptability would still be valid.
Yes, sure. Sorry, I missed which regulation he's referring to. I don't see it on my screen.
Mornay is referring to the certificate of acceptability, and under section 3 or regulation 3, there is the paragraph.
Sorry, got it.
That's right, yeah. It does make the statement that there's a year to reapply.
No, I think I read this differently. What I'm reading this is that if you already have a certificate, 11A says it continues.
Yes.
B says that if you're a government premises, etc., there's those that didn't have to have it in the past.
Yes.
Now have a year to apply.
That's right. Yeah, that's how I understood it. That's how I understood as well. Ashen, with respect to spices, milling and blending, I think there are some new requirements that will impact on everyone, and that being records of processes. So we now actually have to keep production records. So I think irrespective of the product that you're working with, you're going to have to deal with the regulation. I'd like to talk quickly, Janusz, if you don't mind, about bottled water, because what I noticed specifically is Regulation 962 referred to the Codex document for bottled water.
Yep.
Regulation 638 no longer refers to this. So what will happen with regards to bottled water?
Okay, so I know why, by the way. The reason they've taken it out is when you go to supermarkets, they have those like bubbling water fountain type things, and you go and fill up your bottles.
But like bulk milk.
Yeah, but like bulk milk and but insofar as it was in that bubbling column and you filled your own bottle, I think you were okay. But what many supermarkets would do is they would have some pre-filled bottles.
Yes.
Now those pre-filled bottles would not comply with what was in R962.
Yes.
Because so I think they've taken it out literally because Sunbois or somebody made submissions and said, take it out. Maybe not Sunbois, in fact, it's probably against them. So somebody probably approached them to take it out. So, no, unfortunately, the normal requirements would apply as to the extent that it's a foodstuff.
Yes.
It's packaged water.
Yes.
But certainly, they have removed that requirement, and I suppose only they can explain specifically why. But I suspect it's what I'm saying.
Yeah, look, I think that leaves us a little vulnerable as consumers, so it'll be interesting to see whether, you know, there's going to be something to fill that gap. And then the last point, Zubaida, there's another regulation that's going to be dealing specifically with microbiological testing. So regulations, it's still in draft. We haven't had a final, change to that regulation. So watch this space. We'll definitely do another webinar once we've got clarity on that. But at the moment, I think there's still too much discussion going on. And am I correct, Janusz?
Sure. This regulation doesn't deal with any detail about microbiology except for that 100 CFU swabs.
Yes.
The actual microbiological regulations are being hugely amended. I mean, unrecognizable from the previous version.
Yes.
And when they come out, that'll be a whole new thing to comply with.
Whole new discussion. And I think we'll have to have a panel for that one. Janusz, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Everyone, there's Janusz's contact details, and as we said, the webinar will be available for you on our website within a couple of days. We'll actually send out a notification with the link so everybody knows how to get hold of it. We will be doing a follow-up webinar because I think there's still a lot of questions that people have, and as people become familiar with the regulation, I'm sure there'll be some more questions. Janusz, I think we might have to do Regulation 638 Part 2. For those of you that have enjoyed our webinar, I know you've got a lot of useful information out of this. We hope you'll join us on the 26th of July. We'll be having a food safety culture webinar, and we hope that you'll come online and chat to us then. Any questions that we didn't manage to answer, as I said, we will make sure that there's a follow-up article. If you've got other questions, please feel free to email us, info@foodfocus.co.za in relation to the regulation, and we'll try and make sure that you get an answer. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks so much for signing in to Food Focus webinar. Thank you, Janusz.
Thank you, Linda. Have a great day.